All right, I think we are going to get started. So good afternoon and welcome to everyone that's joining us for today's webinar on offshore wind in Atlantic Canada. My name is Elisa Oberman. I am the Executive Director at Marine Renewables Canada, and it is my pleasure to be your host and moderator today. We're really pleased that we're partnering with our member, Cox & Palmer, on this webinar, and I just want to take a minute to thank our colleagues for conceptualizing the topic and inviting us to work with you to deliver what I think is a very timely session today. So as we get started, I'd like to begin first by acknowledging that we are hosting this event from Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, and we acknowledge them as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. So just to set the stage before I pass it over to our speakers, many of you, I think that are attending today are probably quite aware of some of the recent announcements in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador for federal and provincial collaboration to establish a joint management regime for offshore wind by expanding the Petroleum Board's mandates, as well as the intention to conduct regional assessments for offshore wind. So this webinar was thought of before all of that, but I think that gives us a perfect opportunity to talk about it more. And I hope that kind of sparks some interest in what's happening in Atlantic Canada. And then in addition to what's happening here, we're also watching very closely at what's happening in the United States, where the offshore wind sector is growing very rapidly. And just to put that in perspective, there's about 35,000 or plus megawatts of offshore wind development in the pipeline, and a goal set for 30 gigawatts of development by 2030. And just what that looks like from finance kind of investment perspective and economic development. A recent report conducted by the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, which is an organization in the U.S., projects that the U.S. offshore wind industry is going to total about $109 billion within 10 years. So that's obviously a lot of opportunity on the horizon for both international engagement, but also domestic development. And I say that because in Atlantic Canada, we're also seeing a growing business case for offshore wind as many factors fall into place, such as the need to phase out coal, the need for more clean electricity as we focus on increasing electrification, the growing global demand for clean hydrogen, the need to ensure energy diversity and security through use of our own domestic resources, and the need to facilitate a just transition by ensuring that those that are impacted by the move away from fossil fuel development are also finding new business and job opportunities. So offshore wind fits the bill for all of these needs, but we don't have development in Canada yet, or in Atlantic Canada. So that's really what today's, the focus of today is to take a deeper dive into what the opportunity and challenges are for offshore wind in our region. And there's a lot of different aspects to this. Obviously, we could talk about this, I think, probably definitely more than an hour. But today, the focus is going to be on the regulatory framework for offshore wind, how experiences in offshore oil and gas development can be translated to the sector, policy and market initiatives, and then also, what is the perspective of an investor and what is the developer outlook in all of this. So you'll be hearing from 4 speakers, Mohammed Ali Raza, who's partner at Cox & Palmer in the Halifax office, Todd Stanley, who is partner at Cox & Palmer as well in the St. John's office, the Honorable Stephen McNeil, who is a strategic business advisor at Cox & Palmer, and Simon DiPietro, who is an owner and director of DP Energy. So just a reminder for all of those that are joining us, we're going to have, our intention is to have a Q&A portion at the end of the webinar that are following the presentations by the speakers. So as they're speaking, feel free to put in any of your questions through the Q&A function. And I promise I'm going to do my best to get to as many of them, but we'll figure out how we might answer some of them if we can't get to all of them today. So with that, I would like to pass it over to Mohammed Ali to talk more about the regulatory framework and legal framework as well for offshore wind.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and to MRC for inviting us and for co-hosting this event. I feel personally privileged and honored to be a part of this engaging discussion with such esteemed panelists here today, and congratulate MRC on the timing of this. It's just the right timing with the announcement on offshore wind recently for Canada earlier this month. Um, to set the context for what I will be talking about, and if you could move on to the next slide, please. A lot of people would here attending would know that the electricity market in Nova Scotia is very small, in the range of 4,000 megawatts per year. And while development of renewable energy resources is top of mind for many in the province, Nova Scotia still has plenty of untapped renewable energy resources, particularly in tidal and onshore wind. And so additionally, if say projects like Atlantic Loop come around, Nova Scotia will have access to relatively cheap and clean hydropower. And all of this may end up meaning that it may be some time before an offshore wind project could be developed, particularly to service Nova Scotia's domestic supply requirement. On the other hand, we hear that Nova Scotia coastal waters are, from a technical perspective, some of the most feasible waters for offshore wind development. There's obviously geographic proximity to the largest energy consumer in the world, which, again, indicates possibility for export opportunities. And thirdly, some of the things, Lisa, you were talking about, that recent geopolitical events like Russian invasion of Ukraine has further exacerbated the need to ensure energy security globally and in energy markets in Europe, which possibly presents an international market for Canadian offshore wind. Particularly just spending some time to look at what the context and opportunity could be in the short term and in the immediate sort of long term now for Canada and Canadian companies. First one that comes to mind is what you can see is the U.S. offshore wind energy development. United States is set its sights on significant offshore wind development. They're saying 30 gigawatts by 2030, and if the February New York Bight auction, is taken as any indication, ended up having an auction of over 480,000 acres of offshore acreage for north of $4 billion. That's the largest ever land auction in the history of the United States. And we hear 6 more parcels are coming in for bidding later. So they're really making strides there. There's huge development work going on already, 17 blocks, parcels already, and this being added up. So there is a lot of opportunity there. And the opportunity arises from a combination of some protectionist legislation known as the Jones Act, and the fact that US vessels don't have the capacity to undertake operational works in offshore wind development, and therefore are reliant on European service providers and European vessels to do this. European vessels, in short, cannot essentially use the US ports, and as a result are thinking of using Atlantic Canadian ports for marshalling and lay down purposes. So that's a real opportunity for Canadian companies to be involved in those sort of developments and hopefully build capacity for when a Canadian offshore wind project materializes. The second one, of course, is the Canadian offshore wind development on its own, and certainly, as sort of what we've discussed here, that's the exciting part of it. Again, the question is, what is the economic case for Canadian offshore wind, which largely looks like the business case will be based on an export case. And for that, there are 2 markets that you could possibly look at. First being the United States trade and connectivity to that market, and second being using offshore wind to produce green hydrogen and marketing that green hydrogen, whether in North America or abroad. Just spending a little bit of time on United States grid option. The main question there certainly is whether Canadian offshore wind projects located in Nova Scotia can compete with the US offshore wind projects. That's largely because in the US industry, in the utility side of things, there are renewable portfolio standards which incentivize local offshore wind purchase. And the question is whether Canadian offshore wind will have the same access to market that United States offshore wind would have. In this context, I should acknowledge that Net Zero Atlantic, we've worked with them, and Alistair McLean to do some research to identify the viability of offshore wind export to the United States. And it does look like certainly that there is some potential there with offshore wind activity in Canada being recognized as being competitive to what offshore wind activity in the United States will be. But certainly there's more work to be done in that space to evaluate that market. Moving on now to, I guess, what regulatory regime exists here in Canada for offshore wind projects. And I'll ask Amanda if you could move to the next slide. The regulatory environment for offshore wind energy in Canada is quite complicated and changing. There is no, yes, that's right. There is currently no single regulatory or legal framework for offshore wind energy projects in Canada. Leave aside right now the announcement on April 11th for a moment. Creating a new regime, obviously, for something as complex as offshore wind regulations in Canadian waters could be quite complicated. So Canada's constitutional framework, which is the Constitution Act, essentially provides for a scheme of jurisdiction divided between the federal and provincial level of governments. And the division of powers there is really not clear on who has jurisdiction over coastal waters, and more specifically, jurisdiction over regulating the business of offshore wind in coastal waters. As a consequence, both levels of the government could claim jurisdiction over the space in which offshore wind facilities are located. And keeping aside right now the land tenure options, the developers, if we are looking to develop, they are currently looking at multiple regulators, permits, and authorizations if they wish to undertake an offshore wind project currently off the coast of Nova Scotia. So, on your screen, you could see particular examples of different types of acts that could regulate. You're talking about Canadian Energy Regulator Act, Fisheries Act, Species at Risk Act, Canadian Navigable Waters Act, Impact Assessment Act, and similarly, some acts at the provincial level under which a project proponent may need to apply to seek a permit or authorization. This is quite a complex web, and certainly, as you can imagine, it's going to be a challenge for any developer to navigate these waters. Moving on to the next slide, just sort of looking at what land tenure right options we have. I had, when I started off before this April 11th announcement, the three options, and I'm highlighting one now as the leading candidate, since because of the April 11th announcement. Maybe take a few moments to talk a little bit about the other two sort of options for land tenure rights. And land tenure rights, by that I mean, the acreage that a wind developer needs to actually install the wind turbines. So, before this recent activity happened, Public Services and Procurement Canada, PSPC, was claiming jurisdiction on award of seabed rights. There was no sort of clear elaborated process established for award of seabed rights, except that the guidance that was available was, a project proponent could just apply on the basis of a plan, plan detailing their project, their feasibility, the drawings, etc., along with details of consultations with the stakeholders, and then enter into direct negotiation with PSPC for seabed authorizations. This was a very loose process, and certainly we did not see any particular project arising out of this process. As you could see, this wasn't offering a ton of certainty. And in order to be able to do a project, you would have to actually comply, get seabed authorization and also get authorizations under various other regulations and acts that we identified in the previous slide. So certainly this is an option that maybe sort of still exists, but the other option, I guess, that we can briefly talk about is the Marine Renewable Energy Act. Now, this is an act which is a provincial Nova Scotia act, which designates two areas, Bay of Fundy and Bredor Lakes, as areas where renewable energy projects can be developed. So as things stand, authorizations for projects can be given right now for in-stream tidal projects, but the Act provides for a framework as well for introducing offshore wind projects. So the only downside with this Act, of course, is the territorial jurisdiction, because it only applies to the Bay of Fundy and the Bredor Lakes. So if a project is feasible in those two areas, maybe a project proponent could look at this app. Taking us now, of course, to our leading candidate for land tenure options is the Accords Act, and the recent exciting announcement that was made on this to that extent. I mean, let's take a moment to recognize and acknowledge the importance of April 11th announcement, which, for people who haven't heard, is an announcement which essentially says that the federal and provincial governments are going to amend the Accord Acts to expand, refresh, and renew the mandate of the Offshore Petroleum Board regulator to be a regulator for offshore wind and marine renewables generally. So essentially, CNSOEB can, which is now going to be known as CNSOEB, could be issuing land tenure rights very soon. I mean, a lot of work has gone on to actually get us to this level, and I guess it's time to recognize organizations like Marine Renewables Canada and other stakeholders who worked really hard to get us to a point where this important announcement was made. And maybe we are now looking at an industry that could materialize not in 10 or 15 years, but in 5 years. I'd just like to, I'm sort of conscious of time, but would like to sort of talk a little bit about, what this announcement could mean and the various sort of opportunities and challenges that we may be looking at in the future. CNSOEB has particular expertise in offshore petroleum regulation. That's something that can certainly be utilized in in regulating an offshore wind industry. There is this potential for one window operation for developers. The announcement by the regional on undertaking a regional environmental assessment is really a positive movement, which would facilitate environmental approvals at a later stage. So these are excellent initiatives. But some of the challenges ahead, I guess, that we should be sort of thinking about are what is the right Canadian commercial model for any land tenure? Number of models exist. Is it a leasing model? Is it a commitment-based model? Is it a royalty model or concession model? These are the kind of things that regulators, developers will have to think about and have discussions with, because certainly our market, there's a market differentiation between US and Canada for offshore wind projects. So again, this is the kind of things that we should be sort of having discussions on with the stakeholders. I see a number of our developers are part of and are attending this event today. A shout out to Northland and DP Energy, who are really active in this space, and certainly people will be looking to these companies to provide some guidance to the industry as it develops. It's certainly an exciting time, and I'm sort of happy to answer any questions as they come about. So with that, I'll conclude and hand it over to our next panelist.
Thanks very much, Mohammed. So I will now invite Todd Stanley to start your portion of the session.
Thank you, thanks. And again, to echo what Mohammed Ali said, thanks. I want to say appreciate being offered the opportunity to speak. If we go to the next slide, obviously in Newfoundland Labrador right now, there's no offshore wind development, and there have been prospects which have been actively reviewed, but in reality, in respect of most offshore wind discussions, the factors that come up in Newfoundland Labrador are going to be both the industrial experience and the regulatory experience, to build on something that Mohammed Ali mentioned in a second, and the recent changes to the environment. And I've also got to discuss, it may seem inappropriate in an offshore wind project context, but I've got to discuss some announcements that have been made here about onshore wind as well, just to make sure that everyone understands the difference in where we are. So we could move to the next slide. So there has been analysis done in Newfoundland Labrador for the possibility of using offshore wind projects as part of the solution for near proximity power generation for our offshore petroleum projects to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions from production. And there's significant work has been done on that. A recent report was issued by a joint combination between Energy NL and Econex, which are two of the leading NGOs here in the province related to the energy and petroleum industry and the environmental industry. The issues that they raise in these reports, they highlight that while the feasibility for offshore wind will require, first of all, floating platforms. We've got issues where there are pilot projects around the world where floating platforms are being used in ice conditions, but no one is using them in the context of Iceberg Alley offshore the north coast of Newfoundland, which is where much of our petroleum development occurs. And they highlighted that the economics and the feasibility and the studies that be required to use offshore wind for this purpose can't simply be offset by the avoided avoided carbons that would be burned that would be displaced by the offshore wind. There's going to have to be a greater emphasis or incentive, whether it's through carbon tax or greenhouse gas credits or whatever, to make it even feasible to start looking at using offshore wind for these projects. So in the absence of actual offshore wind development discussions here, if we go to the next slide, there are a couple of things that Newfoundland definitely has going for when it comes to the offshore wind industry overall. The first one is that with our 25 plus years of actual activity in our offshore, in one of the most harshest offshore environments in the world, our industry has significant experience in all aspects of any activities that would be required in offshore wind installation. And we're seeing that in two different ways, actually. We are seeing local Newfoundland companies that are taking their expertise internationally and being successful in working with international wind development projects using expertise that was generated and developed here as part of our offshore. And without naming names or possibly pointing to someone who might be on this session, one example is one of our local companies has been quite successful using near surface subsea seismic for the identification and construction for offshore monopole locations and doing complete surveys of prospective fields and the like. The other advantage that we have here is, as Mohammed Ali noted, we share with Nova Scotia this issue of proximity for the possibility of being a marshalling and or fabrication location for the US developments, which in the prospects as noted. And there's movement in this. None of it has been publicly announced yet, but we have a number of facilities which have been developed as a result of our offshore developments and used over the year and have great experience with issues that are very similar and with skill sets that would be very easily transferable to the issues of both marshalling and frankly fabrication for offshore developments. So the industry here has been looking at and has the skill sets to easily pivot to offshore wind, and some of them are doing it now. If I get the next one, thank you. On this one, frankly, there's a little bit of a typo because that says 25 years. It's in reality 35 years. And the importance of this, particularly given the announcement that we're going to talk about in a second, that Mohammed Ali's already spoken about for Nova Scotia, I don't think can be understated, the importance of this. Our offshore regulator, who in Newfoundland is the CNLOPB, has been regulating offshore activity in context far broader than probably would be required for offshore activity regulation for an offshore wind industry. And they've been doing it operationally for 25 years, 24/7, with hundreds of people offshore, 300 kilometers off the Newfoundland coast, and with all the issues that brings up. And I put together a list here of what this experience brings, but these also are aspects of what this regime will bring. And with the announcements, this is the aspects of the regime and the advantages that will come now to, or appear to be coming to offshore wind development. So just to highlight what's in place under the existing petroleum system, just so that everyone is familiar with it, our offshore petroleum regimes under the Accord in Newfoundland, and it's the same in Nova Scotia, include a complete offshore property licensing management, financial surety system, includes a offshore, the ability to handle offshore financing and provide registry systems for interest in offshore financing. There's a complete development application for production projects and an evaluation process, environmental assessment, both ones that are covered by the Impact Assessment Act, but also smaller scale ones that are not, are captured by the Offshore Petroleum Board's experience. Occupational health and safety regime, there's a complete offshore occupational health and safety regime under the Accord legislation in both provinces that took upwards of 15 years to negotiate, and it's already there in place. Also the structures to monitor local benefits to, if the benefits requirements of the Accord are translated to wind energy, experience with the requirements in the application and what's necessary and what can be done and what can't be done in requiring local benefits as part of any development application. And finally, the experience with all the operational issues with support infrastructure. So this is all in the bailiwick of things that have, not only is the legislative structure in place, but operational experience by the parties for more than 35 years, since 1987, when the first Accord Act was passed in Newfoundland. So to go to the recent changes, the recent announcements, somewhat incongruously, we actually had the announcement in Newfoundland about a week before Nova Scotia. They announced that the mandate of the CNLOPB would be expanded to become the CNLOEB, similar in Nova Scotia, to give it jurisdiction over offshore renewable energy. And this is I think, a fundamentally important announcement, that the importance of this can't be overstated, that all of that experience and all of that legislative and regulatory framework that is tested and true will now be available to support the renewables industry. And this is going to require legislative amendments to implement. It's going to be interesting to see how those amendments are structured, because the existing Accord Acts are based around the Atlantic Accord, which were a political deal done in '85. Are the same principles all going to be applied to offshore renewable energy? That is a policy issue more than a legal one. I actually sort of hope they are, because it will simplify then the board's movement of its legislative regime and its administrative regimes over to the regulation of offshore wind. And I think in Nova Scotia and in Newfoundland Labrador, this is a fundamentally good idea. Take advantage of the structures and the experience that you have in place, as opposed to trying to create something new, when in reality you won't realize what you don't have until you realize you don't have it, and until you need it. And the boards have been through all of this and have the experience to do it. And practically, the Newfoundland board has probably got experience in this that it can lend to the Nova Scotia context. Next slide. So I do have the note onshore wind. I'm going to explain in a second why onshore wind in Newfoundland might be appropriate. There's a lot of press here in the province. There's also been an announcement in Newfoundland that we've lifted a moratorium on onshore wind. That's complicated. We've had a prohibition on it since 2006 in the entire province. We still have issues to sort out. We still have legislative prohibitions on wind development and power development on the island, because we have the Muskrat Falls project that we have to pay for. So as early as this morning, though, the minister locally was on the media being very facilitative and promoting onshore wind development here in the island as being something that they want to get behind and they want to see happen. They just have to work out how it's going to occur. And we're going to have legislative amendments on that front as well, coming possibly the fall. One more slide there, I think. So quickly, I'm going to skip this, but much the same as Nova Scotia, Newfoundland doesn't need the power from offshore wind. We have 91% renewables right now with the Muskrat Falls project. So we are, again, as noted by Muhammad Ali, going to be in a transmitted power export circumstance. The final thing I just want to note, I don't get to add pictures to a legal presentation very often. So I think the next slide is talking about how Newfoundland development might be onshore and offshore, because our resource onshore looks like offshore. This is from the Wind Atlas, which is from the Government of Canada. This is the annual wind energy at 80 meters. And as you can see, for the eastern seaboard of the United States and even Nova Scotia, the resource that you're going offshore to chase exists here onshore. So our onshore is, for at least in terms of resources, similar to that for offshore and most other places. So on that note, I know we've got a lot to cover. I'll sign off and move on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. And so now I will invite Stephen to start.
Thanks very much, Lisa, just both to Muhammad Ali and to Todd for their comments. I think the most exciting thing for me, and I hope for those out in the industry, is the fact that the conversation is happening as a regional play as opposed to provinces talking separately or by themselves. The fact that Atlantic Canada is finally recognizing that not only can we look after the energy needs of Atlantic Canada, but we can become an export region of Canada when it comes to energy. When Todd just recently spoke about Muskrat Falls and the amount of energy that his province will receive and Nova Scotia will receive, in order for us to maximize that, whether it's hydro or whether it is onshore wind, the Atlantic Loop, in my view, is a critical component for us to be able to not only meet our targets when it comes to greenhouse gases, but providing us with an opportunity to really deal with some of the issues in Eastern Seaboard. We can attract all the capital. We can harness all the energy we want. If we can't move it, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And capital goes where it can actually get a return. So, in my view, one of the things that Atlantic Canada needs to continue to do in cooperation with the national government is finally deal with the Atlantic Loop and make that a reality and hit targets and timelines to ensure that we can then go out and start talking about the possibility of being able to move energy and deal with energy needs, not only here in Atlantic Canada, but quite frankly, across North America. The exciting part about what I'm seeing is continuing with the offshore conversation, I think is builds off of the Atlantic Loop and the level of cooperation that you're seeing among the provinces and the national government when it comes to how do we deal with the environmental challenges and capitalize on these renewable energies that we have here. And as both Muhammad Ali and Todd had talked about, I don't think you can overstate the importance of the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada's announcement, where they're out now looking at a regional play and answering some of the questions around the environmental issues that'll be faced when and questions that'll come up. The fact that they're in the process of doing that now, even before we have activity or actually leases that have gone out, I think sends a positive signal to the globe, really, that both the federal government and the Atlantic Canadian provinces are taking this seriously. They're taking an aggressive approach to ensure that they're being able to answer some of these questions early on. And the fact that they have now, this week here and apparently already in Newfoundland, acknowledged that the offshore petroleum boards will be the vehicles that we use to do some of that, I think is a positive thing for Atlantic Canada. My one piece to that will be, we have had a tendency to be parochial. I think those two boards need to make sure that they collaborate in a level that probably was not seen in the oil and gas sector. And what I mean by that is ensuring that when the equipment that's required to work, whether it's off the coast of Newfoundland or the coast of Nova Scotia, when it gets permitted, it should be permitted for the region, not a particular jurisdiction. I think those things are critical. It speeds up production and allows that activity to continue to move forward. So I encourage that cooperation that we're seeing at the political level to make sure that it happens with our petroleum boards, because the last thing we need is to be slowing down when it comes to the level of cooperation that we see here, putting in hurdles in the way of whether it's investment or, quite frankly, capital that wants to come into the region here to invest. The other thing that I think we all should be encouraged about is the conversation around hydrogen. As many of you would know, long before what we're seeing in Ukraine. Germany had interest in Canada, and particularly here in Nova Scotia around LNG. They had an equity stake in one of our projects. They realized, a decade ago, the energy mix for Germany and indeed the EU when it comes to gas was real challenging with the amount of gas that was coming out of Russia and the dependence on Russia. About 40% of that was coming out of that area. That provides an opportunity for us. And the fact that the government of Canada and the government of Germany signed an MOU about a year ago, looking at sharing information about how, as we deal with LNG, but making sure that terminals that we're building, that are being built in Germany, are able to use and be able to be adapted to accept hydrogen out of our region. I don't think it's too much to say that we should dream big when it comes to this possibility. There is a tremendous opportunity for renewables in the Atlantic region, whether it is on land or offshore. I think there's a real opportunity, and recognizing it's not just supplying North America. We have a potential here to be a hub to move gas or hydrogen, into Germany. That is a real opportunity for Atlantic Canada to maximize the real value out of what we get from this energy supply that we have in our region. So I think we need to continue to put pressure on governments to recognize that we're ready to go, that the private sector is ready to invest. The private sector wants to be part of the solution. They need to continue to at that unprecedented level of cooperation we're seeing at the political level, and the announcements we're hearing in the last few weeks. We can help Canada meet its global carbon emissions targets in very quickly, at the same time helping deal with some of the energy needs on a global basis. So with that, I will be happy to take any questions at the end. I know there's a few on there for me, but I'd be happy to take them on the end. But I think this is the opportunity for governments to continue this precedent on level of cooperation for the betterment of the region.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And now I will pass it over to our final speaker on the panel, Simon.
Hey everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to speak. I'm just going to put a slightly, as you can tell by the color of the slide, slightly more colorful presentation. Apologies, guys, all good stuff, but I'm not a lawyer, as you probably will gather very shortly. So DP Energy, we're a developer. I think, as you heard, we are interested in Canada, but that's not the only place we're interested. So maybe I'll just tell you a little bit about us, tell you what we're doing, and tell you why I think, just following on from the previous speaker's comments about how exciting this is. We genuinely think there's an opportunity here, and we obviously want to be on the front end of that. So DP Energy, for those of you that don't know, we're a 30-year developer, which put us back into the mid-90s doing onshore wind in Ireland, Scotland, more recently in Canada and Australia. But over that course of 30 years, we've done a number of other different things, including solar. Tidal in Bay of Fundy is obviously a challenge, but one we're working towards. And we are looking across the board in terms of what we can do. And by that, I mean everything from a technology basis. But if I give you the potted history, we started with a 5 megawatt 10 turbine project in the mid-90s based on Vestas V39s, biggest turbine on the planet at the time. We built, well, through Scottish and Southern Energy, we had an arrangement where a project was built in Scotland, which was ultimately theirs, which was the largest project consented within the UK at the time. And that was, I think, around 130 megawatts. That was in the early 2000s, how times have changed. This past year, we've done a deal with Iberdrola on a project in South Australia, 320 megawatts. The turbines are no longer 500 kilowatt, they're now 4.2 megawatt, 150 meter rotor diameter, 320 megawatts in the round. And I think if you just look at that progression of scale, you can see what's changing in this whole piece. In a Canadian context, we've done a wind project in the first round of FIT in Ontario. We've also done more recently 2 projects in Calgary, which were acquired by ATCO. We are working on a 325 megawatt solar PV project in Medicine Hat. And obviously we are working on other things. So what I would say about that is we are, and what I was trying to bring to this webinar was a bit of a, let's say, a bit of developers cynicism, but also a bit of developers entrepreneurial mindset, but also recognition from 30 years of doing this of all the things that can go wrong and what we as a developer need to actually get out and to be able to do a sort of an offshore wind project off Atlantic Canada. One thing I would say, and yeah, leave that one up, thanks, Samantha. One thing I would say is that we have 2 mental mindsets. One is generation mindset, and the other one is enabling. So everything we do is about green power. But that's about green power in a gigawatt hour sense. It isn't necessarily in a we love wind, we love solar, or anything else. We basically are focused on delivering energy, and energy at the right product for a different jurisdiction. So surprisingly enough, the market in Australia right now, although the solar resource is phenomenal, is not solar. The market for developers is very much driven towards, and to investors is towards wind, both onshore and potentially offshore. And the reason for that is for the uptake of rooftop solar, which again is great. It's all good kilowatt hours, gigawatt hours, but actually looks from a developer's perspective, we say, well, actually doing solar in Australia right now doesn't make much sense. Conversely, looking at Canada, I'd be saying, well, the reality is that Alberta is a great market for solar because there is so much wind. So again, this all comes back down to thinking about different markets and different generations. But let's just talk about the offshore piece. So thanks for that, Amanda. So back to my technology neutral. Does it matter if it's fixed wind or floating wind offshore? From a developer's perspective, no. From an investor's perspective, no. The only thing I would say, and caveating that, is fixed wind is proven. There are substantial megawatts, gigawatts of fixed wind around the world, heavily in the UK and within a European market. So there's a lot of confidence in fixed wind right now, and in terms of fixed wind capacity factors and capex costs. Floating wind, less so, but it is coming on dramatically. And I think the projections are, depending on who you believe, that by 2030, we will be looking at parity between fixed and floating offshore wind pricing. That will vary a bit depending on jurisdiction, and also vary a bit on sort of the markets that they're operating, vessel availability and port availability. So in that sort of offshore space, we, over the past few years, and you have to remember the first offshore wind projects in the UK were in the early 2000s. These were the 2 megawatt type 3 megawatt turbines, which, to be perfectly honest, coming back to my cynical developer perspective, never made massive sense to me. Perhaps that was a mistake, but there's clearly we all make mistakes. And what we're seeing now, of course, is not 2 megawatt, 3 megawatt machines. What we're seeing is 15 megawatt, 16 megawatt prospects for 18 megawatt and plus turbines. And speaking from my perspective as somebody who, when we were first looking at 750 kilowatt machines and some madman started talking about 2 megawatts, I thought they were crazy, but I've kind of changed that little philosophical view. But in this sort of the offshore space, so DP, we have a 3 gigawatt pipeline of mixed floating and fixed in Ireland, which we were hoping to get in the water and built pre-2030. So we have a JV with Iberdrola for that. So Iberdrola, as you probably know, is the owner of Avangrid in the US. In a French context with EDF, we have a 1 gigawatt project on the English Welsh side. Again, that will be a floating project. And again, the ambition is that will be pre-2030. What we're trying to do, I think, from a developer perspective, is bring all of those lessons that we've learned over many years into sort of the offshore wind space, whether that's coming from different jurisdictions, different markets, but also from different technologies. And obviously learning as we go. And I can tell you we are learning as we go. So if you go to opportunities there, please, Amanda. Next slide. So just talking about Nova Scotia, and I'm primarily going to talk about Nova Scotia, but I think to the speakers that have gone before me, it's important not to think in a silo. It's not to think in, this is my jurisdiction, this is where I deliver power to. That's certainly a narrative for Ireland, where there's a lot of similarities between the Maritimes and Ireland, a relatively small population. We have about a 7 gigawatt peak grid, but a massive onshore wind resource and offshore resource. And then when you have that disparity, you can then start thinking outside of the box and looking to a bigger picture, whether it's to Germany or to Japan, wherever it is where there is, let's say, a higher density of population and a higher industrial load, or even further south, as you'd say. So I think it's important to think not just in a siloed way about any particular province. It is important to think about, yes, Canada, but also beyond Canada into the US and further afield. And certainly I think hydrogen, which has been touched on a bit there, is a key part of that. The tragedy that's Ukraine at the moment is quite a telling one, I think, from a European context. The fact that so much, let's say, of European gas was coming through Ukraine from Russia is obviously focused everybody's minds. And I think perhaps belatedly, but I think it's definitely having an effect now. So there are deals to be done, I think, with good resource. And the challenge will be, I think, for lots of places around the world, so, well, okay, how cheap can we make power? And I think that's one of the challenges, I think, in terms of this whole piece, is how cheap can you make power and make hydrogen? So I better dash on. So Nova Scotia offshore wind, I think probably everybody on the call knows of the potential. There are two bits to this. Fixed and floating tends to be pretty near shore, unless you're on Sable Island and you're a long way offshore. That brings with it its challenges. Floating wind can potentially be nearer shore. And that's, I think, where we've started to come focused on a lot of things now. I think where we view the opportunity is when and how in terms of scale. I think the issue for trying to do Sable Bank in near term, obviously, is what do you do with that amount of power? And that's going to be one of the big challenges. So we see, if you can flip to the next slide there, please. So we do see a near-term floating wind opportunity, relatively near to shore, but not so far that we're going to create ruffles in terms of visibility. There is a potential there, I think, for a demonstration project in near term, and I think we can bring those lessons in. There are demonstration projects off Scotland now. There has been a project that was towed up to Scotland, funnily enough, from Portugal with a principal power plant. And all of those things demonstrate it can be done. And the wind resource off Atlantic Canada is probably one of the best. It's like west coast of Scotland, west coast of Ireland, good resource, which then leads you into the potential of, yes, it's possible. How cheap can we do it? So if I just flip into what's stopping us do it onto the challenges. Doing a development project like anything else, whether it's onshore or offshore, is actually quite straightforward. You know, licensing, consenting, tariff, offtake, port facilities. Oh, I'm at 11 minutes. Sorry, guys. The way we see things, I think, really is in terms of quite straightforwardly from a developer. It's all about land. It's all about permits. It's all about how do I get paid. It's all about not just how do I get paid, but how do I get the amps away, and then how am I going to build this? And if you take that in the context of all of those things, when we're looking at Nova Scotia and we want to build the cheapest project possible and with certainty, what we really need is certainty on seabed, certainty on the permitting regime. So the April 11th announcement was very welcome. The big uncertainties become how do we really get this stuff built in a Nova Scotia, Atlantic Canada to get sort of local benefit. But obviously the big one from a finance perspective is how do we get paid? In other words, a long-term tariff of some form, We're talking about assets which will be there for 30 to 60 years. And of course, how do we get paid? It comes back to the bottom line. And then I think on just the offtake, by that I mean amps. So the grid piece, I think, also needs to be very much focused on how we do that. So I think I've run out of time, but I will just throw in there just the last two comments there, and please read them and ask questions. But one of the propositions, I think, for Atlantic Canada and Nova Scotia is what can happen if somebody turns up with offshore wind, both in near term and longer term. Our view is a near-term project or projects would make a lot of sense to enable, let's say, Nova Scotia Atlantic ports to become pioneers in the space, which will enable those ports and the hinterland developments of supporting infrastructure and development companies to be able to support US and Canadian assets. So the two examples are there, and I see Alyssa there, so I will shut up in a minute. But there's the two key points that I'd recommend you have a look at. And there is information on the web on these, is the Port of Moston. This was an early mover in the early 2000s. And then the other one was Great Yarmouth on the East Coast. Over time, that has developed into very long-standing port activity, which will continue to have long-standing port activity for the next 30 years as more and more projects get built out within the UK. And I think that's the message here. Early movers on everything in terms of ports, particularly in terms of so forth, development activities and businesses that are ready to make the commitment can actually get an opportunity to get their foot in the door early. And obviously, if you're looking at ports now and say, well, where can I go now? Where is it going to be cheap? Who's got the development? Where's the laydown area? Where's the craneage? Anyway, I'll shut up. I knew I was shooting past the 10 minutes, so apologies for that, but everybody knew that was going to happen anyway. So I'll shut up and say thank you, Alyssa, and thank you, everybody.
No worries, Simon. Thank you very much. So this does bring us to our Q&A portion of the webinar. So I'd invite all of the speakers to turn your cameras on. And we did receive quite a few questions. I had a few of my own, but I mean, we're really here for the audience today and for them to have an opportunity to ask some, burning questions that they may have. So I'm gonna just dive into some of the Q&A questions that we had received. And I kind of a segue from Simon's last point about, looking at both what can we do in the short term, but then also looking at long term. There was a question that came up. So given the relative newness of offshore wind in Canada, what are the legal ramifications for projects that are proposed prior to the development of a clear regulatory and approvals process? And I'm thinking that maybe Muhammad Ali or Todd may have some comments on that, but I don't mean to put you on the spot. So whoever would like to start first, that'd be great.
Sure, I'm happy to start, and that's what we are here for, to be put on the spot, so no worries. No, but that's a great question. I think certainly what we are hearing is that, none of these, like most of the projects that we've heard about in the offshore wind space are long lead projects. Like, they are significant infrastructure projects, which will take some time to develop and be on ground. If somebody has made advancements under the current legal regime, one would hope that work that has been done would be transferable and would transition into the new sort of regime which is being proposed right now. That ideally would be what I foresee happening in this space. Certainly, from a developer's point of view, within the current regime, you're dealing with 5 or 8 or 7 agencies, at the least. The new regime promises maybe dealing with, if not single, then 2 or 3, which is substantially still better than what we have right now. So I do think, any project proponents who are looking at this will be looking at CNSO-EB for some guidance in seeing, how fast that regime is going to develop, because it may be worthwhile waiting for that regime to develop as you put your project forward.
Good point, Mohammed. Anybody else on that one?
So I would just say in terms of the risk, it's all about risk from a developer investor's perspective. Developing a big onshore wind project in Canada is going to cost you $5 million, let's say, in the round. Getting a sizable offshore wind project going in 1 meter of water, I'm being facetious, is not going to cost you 5 million. It's not going to cost you 10 million. It's probably going to cost you 6, 7, 8, maybe 10 times that just to get to FID. So certainty about everything is really what everybody's looking for on investment.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, so next question, and this is addressed to Stephen. So to former Premier McNeil, do you have any thoughts on how the new accord will address the issue of who gets licenses to develop offshore wind and how the province can ensure that it is the primary beneficiary of those developments?
When the announcement, I believe, was made with the Petroleum Board, that was part of the conversation. That's what the exercise will be. The two levels of government will work with the regulator, and it will talk about licensing, what's local benefits agreements, those types of things. I would say, though, I think we need to be mindful of, we have a real opportunity to be an energy player, I believe. I think we need to be very careful how parochial we become. Yes, we want the benefit of that. How do we use that energy to drive other economic opportunities? Listen, whether it's a developer of an energy project or manufacturing plant, one of the things they want is stable, secure energy supply. Obviously, we want to be able to maximize that, but we need to look beyond Atlantic Canada when we look at this resource and look at the opportunity and start thinking big. I believe the Atlantic Loop provides us an opportunity into the Eastern Seaboard, but with other, whether it's hydrogen or other opportunities, we can be a player in the energy market globally, I believe.
And the other thing too, to that point, I was going to mention, because you made the point about collaboration earlier when you were talking and collaborating between Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. And I think one of the things that we're seeing with the US market is that there's also gaps and they don't have the vessels and things that are needed. So, I mean, we're going to see some of the same things probably here as well, depending on how quickly things move. So I think collaboration is going to end up being a very key part of all of this. So I think
and I think Todd had mentioned earlier that with the activity in our offshore, there's a tremendous resource there. It's a human resource. There's a lot of opportunity for Newfoundland and Labradorians, Nova Scotians, and Atlantic Canadians, not just our two provinces, to really use what they've learned how to work in that marine environment already, to be able to transfer that into the renewable energy sector. So I think it's a real opportunity.
I have time for one question, so I'm going to just read this last one. And this, I think, I'm not sure which one of you would be best suited to answer, but it's open. So would it be easier to add offshore versus onshore wind to an Atlantic Loop project, given that generation is more highly concentrated? So basically the question is, should we be focusing more on offshore wind as a complementary resource when we're thinking about the Atlantic Loop rather than onshore?
The Atlantic Loop for me is really a highway to get electrons into a marketplace that's looking for them, to find a customer. It's agnostic whether it's on land or offshore. I think the more energy we can put into the system to supply contracts, whether it's in the US, deal with our own energy needs, making sure that, but I don't think it really matters which one it is. But in terms of the Atlantic Loop is not only for that, I think we've got a lot of hydro stranded in Newfoundland and Labrador, and as Atlantic Canadians, we should be working together to ensure that our friends in Newfoundland and Labrador have a market for that energy. What's the best way? It's not just Muskrat Falls. We open up that Atlantic Loop. We really provide an opportunity for private sector capital to come in and develop other hydro projects or wind projects. But if they don't have a way to get it to their customer, why would they invest? They just won't. It's that simple. So I don't think it matters whether it's onshore or offshore.
All right. Anything else on that one before I close this off? Unfortunately, we don't have very much more time for questions. So what I would say to the audience, I mean, this brings us to the end of our time, and I hope that the webinar was useful and a starting point. I feel like we really just scratched the surface, obviously, so there could be more of these in the future. I would also look to the audience to, email us and let us know if there are other topics or areas you'd like to take a deeper dive, but I hope that it did provide a bit of an understanding of what the opportunities and challenges are when it comes to offshore wind in Atlantic Canada. And I would also say you can visit marinerenewablescanada.ca. We have quite a few different activities we're leading ourselves to support both international engagement and domestic development. And you'll also see that Cox and Palmer has developed a number of articles and briefings on offshore wind, and I'm sure that there'll probably be more in the future because there's obviously a lot of work ahead of us. So I just want to thank our speakers for your time today and for your insights. And thanks again to Cox and Palmer and everybody we worked with to get this webinar going. And thanks to our audience for joining us. This has been recorded, so you can access the webinar after this. And thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.